legalizefreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Beyond politics, poverty and war. legalizefreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to legalizefreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guests today are John Bunzl and Nick Duffell, who join us to discuss their book, The Simpol Solution. Although both parts of this interview may be taken on their own, it is strongly recommended that you listen to both. Energy crisis, fossil fuel depletion, wealth inequality, mass migration, economic collapse, environmental disaster, political instability, nuclear proliferation, terrorism. Why are governments and major international organisations so hopelessly unable to solve our mounting global problems? The truth is that in an age of globalization, free-flowing capital, and banking without borders, government hands are effectively tied. Regulations or other schemes which might rein in the worst excesses of business and industry are rarely enacted or even considered, simply because they would lead to cuts in corporate profits. Taken with the fact that governments in general are adept at drafting bad legislation, often operate a revolving door policy with business in terms of recruitment, and are themselves hardly paragons of best practice when it comes to energy, economy, environment, or any other stress point you can name, we face an apparently intractable situation. Some think the answers lie in global government and big thinking, others in localism and small-scale solutions, but while both are generally designed to sidestep bureaucratic gridlock, for many they smack of communism, fascism, or some other ism in which a largely unelected elite dictate the rules to everyone else. Through the lens of conventional politics, of whatever colour, it seems that we can have either unity or diversity, but not both. In the meantime, of course, our predicament continues to get worse, and as we look extinction in the eye yet again, we wonder once more, is there really no alternative? Okay, Nick, in this segment we're going to be talking very much about the psychology behind these issues, the personal psychology, collective psychology, and how what it may take to make a difference this time is our way of thinking about ourselves, about the world, and about our place in the world. Now, we've already heard in the previous section a personal introduction from you, a little bit about your background and your work. The previous interviews that I've done with you, we've been talking about your work on boarding schools and the education system in general, particularly here in the UK. I'm just wondering, at what point have you always had an interest in politics and economics and global affairs? Because that's kind of a natural extension of your work on education, because of course the people who go into these positions of influence and power are educated in a certain way. So perhaps you could just tell us, was that the obvious overlap into global affairs for you, or was there another, or did you just have a general concern as a thinking, feeling person who's watching, certain trends unfold in the world?
No, it's a little bit the other way around, because I was when I was a student, I was a bit of a lefty selling socialist work on cold high streets and going on marches with people. And I think I had my first ever psychological thought when I was doing that, when at a certain point I realized there was something actually going wrong in the way we were doing things, that everyone that I hung around with seemed to be really marching against their fathers, really. They were sort of, I didn't have the language then, but I would say that they had projected their personal unfinished business into the political sphere. And and then it was something that struck me as really odd. And then I ended up turning away from that after the beginning of the 70s. And I spend a lot of time doing self-sufficiency and learning crafts and trying kind of out different lifestyles. And then it wasn't till I had my own psychological breakdown stroke breakthrough that I turned to psychology, to psychotherapy, and eventually trained myself. And then, as you know, I developed quite by chance this special interest in people who, like me, who'd been through the public school system and who'd been raised in a specific way to become elites. And I'd always been a bit tentative with the politics of it, because psychotherapists, certainly in those days, were supposed to actually keep their noses clean and keep dirty politics out of the consulting room. And if people talked about something, that we were to analyze it in terms of their inner conflicts. So in a way, both ends were a bit too extreme. And then what happened was that when we had this incredible, to me, election of 2010, which perhaps people can hardly remember with everything that's happened since, when the products of public school education, the damaged products, were being voted in again, which I had been describing in my book. So that's when I set out to write about the book Wounded Leaders, and talk about the political and national fallout of this kind of education system on the kind of leadership we had. And eventually an early draft fell into the hands of John Bunzl, who then contacted me, asked him to join me on this project, and I know you've been speaking to him.
Okay, and that's how you then got involved with his Simpol initiative, which had been around, actually, I found out, since 2000. John explained to us how, the work that's gone on in the meantime, that this isn't a new concept that's just popped up.
No.
So, and what did you make of, when you first saw what he was putting together, the Simpol idea? Did you see the obvious intersection with what the work you'd been doing?
No, I didn't. In the beginning, my wife pointed it out to me, and I thought, oh, this is all a bit airy-fairy. And I didn't think it was really a goer in the beginning. But what happened was, and I knew about it, but when John contacted me and said that he liked the psychological ways I was combining politics, approaching politics in my book, and he wanted to invite me to come and think about Simpol through that kind of lens, I then started to actually look at it, take it a bit more seriously, and begin to study it. And lo and behold, quite simply, I was absolutely convinced, because the idea in itself is so absurdly simple, and yet it's something which John has worked out how we might, if we had enough people taking it really seriously, make some kind of changes very, very fast. And I had the sense that we just can't wait for everyone to see the light before we get the politics that our world needs. We need something to happen pretty well now. And, I didn't want us to wait till we had a Mad Max scenario until we start opening our eyes in the world. So Simpol, that John had designed, seemed to have a very simple and good philosophic background, but also a very well worked out pragmatic range and application. And I like that, because I've always been a bit of a practical mystic myself.
Now, if listeners here haven't already done so, they should listen to part 1 of this, where I talked to John about the basic concept behind Simpol, aka simultaneous policy, this concept. And any resistance that I've encountered when I've discussed the idea, and John certainly has, and you will have as well, is usually along the lines of, so what are you suggesting? Oh, well, we've heard this before. This is nothing new. It's unrealistic. It can't be done. Blah, blah, blah. And I've been talking about crises in environment, economics, energy for a long time. And I always said that for me, the key was psychological. That was the real battlefield. That's where the victory, if there was going to be one, would be won. Changing how we think about these issues, how we think about ourselves and our place in the world. So I don't know what reaction you've encountered so far, but that's the difference. I said it during the segment with John, and I'll say it again. The basic nuts and bolts of this are not new, because how we will implement change is pretty much unchanged. There's certain things that we need to do. There's certain things that we should really stop doing. But in order to see it as possible, we have to change our thinking, because I think that the current state of affairs, the status quo, for many people, even those who don't like it, appears to be so self-evidently the only way to do it, that they can't even imagine almost an alternative.
Yeah, that's right. So, let me try to put it out as straightforwardly as I can, because what I see is that yes, it's certainly not news that human beings need to make a mass attitudinal shift in order to sort the problems of their world, which are of increasing magnitude and increasing complexity all the time. So that is absolutely new. But what you get in most of the sort of approaches to new politics is a notion that we should do this and we should do that, and this should be done, and the government should do this. Now, you see, the psychological piece here is that consciousness and the thinking we have is a partner of actually to our will. So the issue is we can have lots of good ideas and lots of good thoughts, but what's the will element of it? What's the action? How might we put this into action? And the thing in terms of dealing with existing governments is how can you then convince and impel governments to put something into action? And so this is where Simpol is extremely well versed, because it's really looked at that relationship. And there's another dimension of will and consciousness is like what are the obstacles to human beings having the needed attitudinal shift at a particular time in history, and can we really define them very precisely, and can we actually find ways that we can help ease people through the various obstacles, their resistances to thinking at a larger level? Now that's really complicated, and that is where you need some quite precise psychology. And so one of the things that I've been doing in this book is going through in quite detail what are the resistance that we find when we look around to people thinking, for example, beyond the familiar notion of the nation state, or beyond the familiar notion of the people who don't, as it were, get represented by their governments, and the people who sometimes have these sort of rather good, worthy eco-warriors who find their causes for them. Because what I see psychologically in all those kind of elements, you've got a very crystallized stuck situation.
Yes, and I've often thought that, and this has been going on for such a long time, because you think back to the oil crisis, back in the 1970s,
Mm-hmm.
and that was also a time of rising environmentalism, and it actually looked for a while that they were going to win the day, because things looked so bleak, and you had the Club of Rome doing reports, and but then that all changed with Reagan and Thatcher, and it was like morning in America again.
Yeah.
So that proved how something that seemed kind of a rising tide, that really its time had come, could just be flipped on its head. So this feeling that we're a crunch point is also actually not new. And I've even talked to people who said, well, humanity's probably had seeming crunch points down the millennia, various points where this cannot go on, and then somehow it does go on. And it's very much a feeling of, but I still think that the feeling of unstoppable force meets a movable object, I can't imagine it ever being quite on this scale before, because, so many of our systems are now truly globalized. When I say unstoppable force, immovable object, I mean the sense that something must be done versus nothing can be done. And, clearly that cannot hold either.
No, you're absolutely right. And the other thing is that we're all of us who involved in sort of psychopolitics at the moment is actually, it's not just the magnitude, the urgency of things. It's also the speed of events at the moment. And, one of the things that we're looking through this kind of lens that we've been looking through, and Simpol has helped John and I realize, is that one of the things that seems to be going on is that we are in humanity is in a sort of at the moment in a bit of a regressive mode. Because the next major change, I mean, if you look to history, there's been lots of major changes which have totally changed the game, like printing, press, like the Industrial Revolution, way back in time, like the beginnings of agriculture. Of course, in our age, it's been the information technology. But the results, the implications of the information technology combined with globalization, driven by this reawakened and neoliberalism that you talked about, started to come in the 70s and has been reinventing itself at an extraordinary speed, means that the context has completely changed at the moment. And one of the things that we're hanging on to en masse is the notion that governments and nations can be sovereign. And when we all know, actually, is the markets rules everything at the moment. That now with global information, you cannot really close your borders in the same way that you used to. You cannot actually. You're never going to stop the movement of labour now. We can cause a temporary halt on immigration, but we're never going to stop this enormous movement of people. So there are changes afoot which are all about being more and more and more global, and nations and those of us who are saying, I've lost out under globalization and actually, I'd be better off if all these foreigners weren't here. It's an understandable cry. But it's actually not meeting the current reality. So in a way, there's a huge sea change just ahead of us, actually moving to this new way of thinking. We will get there anyway. So what we want people to see in reading the Simpol Solution is actually how they can voluntarily cooperate with this process and help the crisis be less critical and help persuade our politicians, who actually have got their hands tied because they can do very little, how we need to actually back them, persuade them, and we need to educate them.
Yeah, you mentioned regressive movement, and I think you certainly see this in the lurch to the right for the most part, but also a lurch to the left to some extent. I mean, for every Nigel Farage or Donald Trump or whatever, who come along taking us somewhat back to tribal ways of thinking, tribal psychology. There's someone else on the left, Bernie Sanders. I mean, you look at what Jeremy Corbyn's now saying, particularly now that a UK general election has been announced. Yeah. And, they can sound seductive to people who feel themselves in a pincer movement. It can be back to the old ways, make America great again and all that. But even at best, in their wildest dreams, what they might achieve is at some temporary amelioration for some of their people for a little while, and then the same meta trends that are in place now carry on anyway. So, and that's actually some of the most interesting material for me in the book, is where you set out these different modes of thinking, which are not dissimilar to, Maslow's hierarchy of needs type categorization. Yeah. And then you talk about a transcendent form of psychology that we have the opportunity to move to, and how all these different categories overlap. I mean, for me, that's some of the most compelling material there. And it's exactly that sort of material for me that hasn't really been brought into thinking about the current political and economic sphere. It's always seen as very, that's all very interesting stuff about human psychology, but how do you really apply that to the real world? So
no, that's right. It was all much, the fact that psychotherapists, psychologists were developing this incredible, powerful tool, way of understanding ourselves and the world and keeping it to our consulting rooms in a way was very convenient. And what it has meant is that the political science has grown up without this. And it's also grown out without not just psychological understanding, but psychological compassion. You see, if we move to the levels of thinking in a minute, but one of the things I really would like to say is that I think we have to be really compassionate to people who are caught in this struggle and this regression at the moment, because as a psychotherapist, I understand a bit about the process of change, and what I know is that we do not go into change unless we absolutely have to. And the bigger the change that seems to be ahead of us, the more we actually start pedaling backwards. So we can say it's a regression, but it's a regression which is understandable because we all actually hate and fear the unknown. This is just existential. So if you're telling people, if you were to go out to tell people who live in communities where they've seen the demographics in their street being knocked to bits over the last years with people they don't understand and know, and say, look, mate, you've got to actually think more globally, you're never going to get anywhere, because actually you've got to take into account the situation of those people, and they have to be eased in really, really gently. They have to be they have to be allowed to feel safe, they have to be listened to, and the left, I've got to say, as an old lefty, the left has been terrible at listening to people recently. So it's not surprising we get all these protests, where the sort of far right do well, who are promising a kind of chauvinism and return to a completely impossible protectionism, which is never going to, it's never going to be possible, because we are now in a global world. So how do we think globally and constructively? Well, we have to, first thing, before we even think about doing that, we have to take account the emotions that are involved and the identities that are at threat.
Yeah, you mentioned having compassion there, and I think that's something that has very much been lacking, certainly in the public debate on these issues of late. Because psychologically, we have this thing of this phenomenon of projection, and the other, which is very much encouraged by the rise of the right. That you can see the source of your problems in that neighbour who arrived from Romania or whatever it happens to be. It's their fault, and if only they went away, everything would be okay.
Oh yes, they're working on it. They're working off it, aren't they? I mean, and that's what I think is rather scandalous, that we haven't educated TV anchors and commentators enough to say, well, hang on a minute, this is, this is the politics of blame. You're just projecting. This is bad for people. I'm not having that on my show. That's the sort of thing they should be saying. We should be much more educated psychologically. Yeah.
And yet, and that's the projection, because the acknowledgement that would perhaps transcend that would be not only that we're in this together, but actually we played a part in this as well. And, you think of our materialist society, the emphasis on consumerism.
Yeah.
And, there's a sort of, I think there's disavowal there, isn't there, really? That we can almost some people can even consciously acknowledge that a system is bad or an aspect of it. They can say, oh, the banks, there's a tremendous problem there, we need to change, or, our over-reliance on fossil fuels is a tremendous problem. But it's almost like if you then acknowledge it, this is bad, this is a major problem, it almost allows you to carry on benefiting from that, because, well, that's, I've acknowledged the banks are bad, but I need a bank account, whatever it happens to be.
Well, yeah. And of course, as Varoufakis points out in his book, that actually one of the things that we keep forgetting is that the real wages have been going down since 1973, and that's all been hidden by borrowing and financialization. So the people who are involved in this regressive politics have actually seen their lot get worse and worse and worse and worse, and they have to have someone to blame, because our system is not accountable except on a sort of 4 or 5 year democratic cycle. And even then we have seen the way you can present it can actually mask everything that's hidden. Everything that's actually, it could be driving it. So you've got that group of people, and then you've got the other group of people whose identities are quite important, who we meet when we're presenting new political ideas, which is a sort of global justice movement and the eco warriors and the sort of new left, and to actually suggest that they might also have some changing in their thinking to do is quite a tricky business, because one of the things that you see from individual psychotherapy, that people have very, very large investments in parts of their personality they identify with, and one of the trickiest ones that I've ever worked with in my practice is something we call the rebel subpersonality, where the rebel is a sort of warrior for truth and justice, and using their anger and dissatisfaction to fight off the bad, to fight against the bad corporations or the bad governments, which is all very well. The problem is the investment in being the good guy against the bad guy. The investment in the role is so enormous that it leaves very little room for curiosity about what might be another way forward, another way of shifting out of that that way of viewing the world. And this is where I come back to this will aspect again, because some psychologists will say, well, actually what happens when you've got your investment so heavily invested into a particular identity, you get your will trapped there. So the will is trapped by that particular subpersonality. So you really can't move out. So, also perhaps allowing people, thanking them for going on marches and protesting and et cetera, and then suggesting, actually, look, there are other ways of doing this in which we can actually all be together, because the politicians are actually, they are also pretty powerless. And you try to look at this world through the kind of lenses we're suggesting, and there are all kinds of different ways of approaching, start to open themselves up.
Well, you mentioned there about the politicians, for the most part, being pretty powerless, and certainly that's disempowered us how, millions, billions, in fact, of individuals feel in the teeth of these various crises. And that brings back to mind a thought that, without necessarily having an answer to it, but a thought that I've had for a long time, is that, we talk about certain trends happening and, that seem to be against the interests of most people. Then we start to think about, well, I don't want these things to happen. I'd like this to change and that to change, because it'd be better for me. It'd be better for everyone I know. But we arrive at the idea that it seems that the vast majority of people don't want certain things that are happening. They either want or would be better off in a situation that would be different to that which is. So then it makes us wonder, well, if we have this, if it's purely a numbers game, then how do we seem to be operating overall, generally speaking, a system that actually is to the detriment of most people? It's kind of, how do we actually arrive at that? And then you start to, and this is part of the problem, I think, people start to think about, well, who is actually responsible? And then we really struggle to identify individuals, and I think that's quite an important issue, because we then hear that it's X corporation and Y corporation. Well, who is that? And we tend to forget there's actually people there too. That every decision that's made, even if it's made by a computer, is ultimately made by a human being. Yeah,
of course that's true. The way that we look at the big picture through the Simpol lens is really to say that, as you know, from talking to John, that actually that everybody is caught up in a kind of a race which they don't know how to stop. Now, in that, there are some who are doing extremely well, big corporations and the global rich, and there are others who are doing extremely poorly. but you see, so you can go to either one of those aspects and devise a polarized politics, or you can go to actually what is the game going on here that needs to change. And one of the chief elements in that is that we see in Simpol is that because of the competition has completely reached its tipping point, and every government, every corporation leader is responsible for keeping his ship afloat and doing as well or better than the others, is that no one kind of knows how to get off the rat race at the moment. And in the meantime, the enormous global problems, which involve huge amounts of investment of time and energy, but mostly will, don't get dealt with because everyone's busy surviving, competing. So the idea of creating a politics which works through rafts of policies rather than different personalities or parties has to be something that we take very, very seriously. If you look at the French election at the moment, you've got 11 different candidates, 4 of which who are allowed, spoken about as front runners. And you have the biggest don't know section of the population France has ever known. They don't know who they're going to vote for because they know the whole thing is a kind of tactical game, but actually they can't see actually what the difference is. You've got the far left and the far right who are calling for protectionism, which we know in the long run isn't going to work. And then we've got the business as usual centrist parties. So we've got to have a much bigger overview. We've got to see that actually now is the time to begin to see how we can go through the established means and get people to think of that they're part of one world, that they have an identity which can include being English, can include being European, can include being a world citizen. I can include being a North Londoner and even have a friendly rivalry for South London. But actually, at the heart of things, we can expand our identity and we can begin to put pressure on our politicians to try to implement things which are going to affect us at the whole, rather than staying in the same polarized game. And that takes a bit of effort because we've not used to thinking like that. So one of the things we do in the Simpol Solution book is we take readers through a sort of emotional stages of an emotional journey that you might have to go on to begin to, or recognize that you're on, to come out the other end of this journey, having grieved the loss of our familiar world, where there are people you can blame, where there are sovereign nation states, to realize we're in a totally different ballgame and we've got to think along world-centric lines if we're going to get things sorted.
You touch upon there one of the main objections that I dealt with to all this, speaking with John, which is a well-established idea that any global solution to anything, in the minds of many people, objectors, is its world government, its usual spectre of, more unaccountable, unelected officials. They look at the performance of certain global bodies and that's pretty dismal. And I think, so you're seriously suggesting that if we have, faceless bureaucrats decide everything, a technocracy, that's somehow going to solve the problems. And you mentioning there about local identity reminds us that we're absolutely not talking about this. And a lot of people, even those who are advocating global solutions, a lot of them still speak along the lines of, we need to forget about religion and forget about race and forget about difference, and multiculturalism is the way to go, and we need to be more, everything needs to be ironed out, differences need to be ironed out. So perhaps you could speak to the psychology of identity and difference and culture, and how that's not inherently evil, that wanting to keep your North London identity, or for me to identify with the island of Ireland isn't just a block to us finding a global way forward. In fact, when I've read some forward-thinking material about the solution to global problems, recently did an interview based on the work of the late David Fleming, who was quite a visionary along these lines.
Yeah.
He was celebrating culture and locality and what have you. That we're not looking to erase that. So perhaps you could address that from a psychological perspective. Again, just put it in a nutshell, how the idea of holding on to an identity for a place or a race or whatever, a culture, isn't in and of itself evil. Because I was always told, as far as the European Union was concerned, that yes, we'd be together, but you could go to France and have wonderful food and culture and music, and you could go to Germany and get the German equivalents, and that was to be celebrated, but that seems to have got lost somewhere along the way.
Well, no, I mean, it hasn't. It hasn't got lost. It's just got lost in the narrative. You see, the thing is that the psyche is like an onion, and it's many layered. So we all know that when we take our, when we do our sort of inner work and we go inside these layers and we discover these different layers of ourselves and often discover various unhealed or unlistened to parts from childhood which are down towards the core and have been wrapped around in other layers. That is actually a model that describes the psyche itself, you see. And so you can talk about these layers in other ways. I mean, the brain is like that, so that the brain is wrapped in different layers, from the most ancient parts of the brain to the most recent parts of the brain, and so that whenever we are in a sort of regression or fear, when we feel fear or threat, we don't use the most logical, curious, reflective parts. We use our kind of our old wired brain, which says strangers are dangerous, get out of here or kill them, and that's all wired in for our safety. So that's in the brain. Your psyche is not the brain, but the psyche and the brain have similarities in this layered approach. Now, identity is the same. You see, so identity is, you can have various cores of identity, like your gender, like your locality, the colors you wear, the football teams you support, the religion you belong to, all sorts of different layers of identity which define you and you believe in more or less thoroughly. Of course, people say that when they're approaching death from a spiritual perspective, identities seem to be increasingly meaningless. But our identities are things we cling on to. And in old days, even religion was like that. Religions were very local. You had gods of all the localities. The Greek gods are all the gods are local. The Celtic gods are the same. And when sort of Catholicism went over to Mexico and Latin America, it became incredibly localized. And Hinduism is like that. So, we can both belong to and love a local place, and we can belong to a bigger one. Now, one of the ways we define ourselves and we strengthen our identity is by saying, I am not this. So I can strengthen my masculine identity by saying, I'm not a woman, I'm not a girl. And that is a way of investing rather rigidly into your identity. It does strengthen it, but it makes it more brittle. So, for example, in the old days when boys are brought up thinking boys don't cry, otherwise you would be a girl and I'm not allowed to be a girl, you start to invest in a rather rigid male identity as someone who doesn't deal with emotions. Well, actually, it's not true. We're all emotional beings. So it's not true that you have to, if you support Arsenal, you have to hate Tottenham. But that is encouraged. All those local derbies are always the fiercest, to strengthen the identity. But so what you see when you look at it with the psychological lens are these overlapping layers, which, when they are flexible, you can move in and out of. So you can be an Englishman and a European, and I can be I'm definitely European as opposed to an American, because, I hate their kind of politics and I'm deeply against what they do with their guns. It's just very un-European. But I love their music and I love their literature. So you can expand at will your identity and take on deeper levels. So we could all be human beings, citizens of the planet. We could all still have friendly rivalry with the French rugby team, should we want it. But if we take our identities too seriously and invest in, I am an Englishman and it's the foreigners that's doing this country in, we don't have that fluid movement between the layers of the onion layers in our psyche, and then we're not flexible enough to deal with the kind of crises that are at our doorstep at the moment, because we do have to be very creative, very curious, and very flexible as human beings for the next period in history, I think.
Yes, and when you move away from aspects of identity that can be very ephemeral, if England gets called something else, it doesn't destroy the land of England. It doesn't destroy the rivers and the hills and the trees. That's still there. So, and when we unpeel some of those layers, we discover that a lot of us actually, from all sorts of parts of the world want similar things. You could boil it down and say what we want is to be happy and free with our friends and family and have some kind of decent life. That's
sure.
You might start from that position.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
How would you characterize the aspects of identity then that can survive all of that? Because I don't know about you, but I feel that I don't feel overly threatened by people from other parts of the world coming to, and I'd imagine a lot of people like this, coming to necessarily live in my vicinity. The perceived threat really arises if they say, well, actually, you can no longer have a, happy, decent life with your friends and family because, we're going to somehow affect that. But there's these other ephemeral aspects that really don't matter. So some people feel that, as you say, identify with these brittle things, that somehow their core identity is lost if some of that stuff's taken away. But there's something within us that I think forms a healthy identity, something that can outlive almost anything, or survive almost any perceived assault or actual assault, whatever, that isn't just about things that don't really matter. For example, you talked about approaching death and how identity would seem to become less important. So I think there's somewhere in between all of that. You find people that can be, if they're not suffering physical assault or very direct threats to their lifestyle, can be happy anywhere because they have an inner core. It's in good shape, or it's healthy, or it's...
Well, I think you're talking about resilience, really, aren't you? I mean,
yeah.
A resilient inner core, yes. And of course, although when it's down to individuals, there's a lot of this is dependent on, how well attached you've been and how whether you've had caretakers support a good sense of self in you, and you've got a good self-esteem. But I think when we're looking on the sort of on the larger level, on the politics, on the psychopolitics of nations and of civilizations, I mean, one of the things we have to realize that we've gone through very big leaps already. It's like 400 years ago since we really started moving out of the late medieval period, where we thought of ourselves as all belonging to God's family, and actually we weren't to question why things happen. And out of that, we have the European Enlightenment, and we have the scientific and the Industrial Revolution and modernism, which has gone on to sort of create this global destructive monster that's bugging us. But the other thing, of course, it created is the whole liberal philosophy of the Enlightenment, whereby we started to look at what are the rights of man, and one of the rights is a right to freedom and a right to not to be oppressed. Now, when that starts to be threatened, when it starts, when the crunch time comes, when sufficient people feel unhappy enough, unsafe enough to start to be not feeling that they that they have their civil liberties cared for, they start to forget about those of others, and they look around to the strong man to protect their little in-group. Now, of course, that is the risk of the sort of things going on at the moment with these kind of regressions where, as it happened in the 30s, the liberal view, the liberal way of life, the freedom for all, actually was under severe threat. And totalitarianism was on the march. Now, we must never take our eye off the ball, because that always can happen as a possibility where people feel increasingly powerless. They look to the strong leaders. I think that's what you're seeing in the world today with Putin and Trump and co. And this, I think it makes it all the more important that we keep on realizing that we have an obligation to try to show how human beings can soften their rigid identities, can come together and cooperate by realizing what the real obstacles are in our world situation. And they are not because other countries are being invaded by other people. They're because there are an awful lot of us, and we've been out of control on this competition wheel for too long. And in the meantime, our resources, our planet is suffering, and there are all kinds of things that we have to regulate, and we have to start investing into the poorer countries in the world where people are doing all this immigration from. And we're not going to be able to do that properly until we have very large agreements on corporation tax, on tax havens, all the sort of things which invite us to cooperate with each other as if we are friends and neighbours and not enemies.
I mentioned earlier about the materialist society that we live in and how consumerism, is kind of a release valve for a lot of people. No matter what sort of psychological stress they might be under, you can always go shopping. I think that one of the situations on a practical level that we're facing, if we talk about, resource use and our energy supply and how we might attempt to roll out the sort of lifestyles that, in general, the likes of you and I benefit from in, Western or other industrialized countries, how you might attempt to roll that out to a global population, an increasing global population. It would seem, given our current levels of technology, that is absolutely impossible, and that's becoming increasingly evident. Quite a stumbling block or a hurdle comes from us identifying too much with these sort of like lifestyle trinkets, stuff that, and we have age-old wisdom telling us that these things don't matter and we shouldn't seek fulfillment in these places. But it's coming to that acceptance that we might have to do with less materially. And of course, the very words I've just said are betrayed by the champions of the status quo as, we're all going to have to go into poverty, or we're going to have to lose X, Y, and Z. That's seen as inherently bad, despite the fact that downsizing, popular movement at the moment, in many industrialized countries, the tiny house movement and people doing with less, and lots of people saying, well, actually, when I gave up this and I actually became happier. And I know a lot of people who were in very well paid, relatively speaking, jobs, high powered jobs, who just got to the end of their tether. When they threw all that away, they kind of found themselves. So, and I can even hear it now, people detecting echoes here of utopianism and communism, and we're all going to be the same, and the zeitgeist movement of a few years ago, and we're going to iron out all the differences and what have you. But I think when you get past all of that, if that's even possible, it cuts again to this idea of identity, and that we are something more, not less. We're more than televisions and computer consoles and all the rest of it. And where do we actually find the greatest satisfaction in life? For me personally, and I think it's the same for other people, it is in other people. I wouldn't want to live life without friends and family, loved ones. That's what gives it meaning. Now, it doesn't mean you can't have nice stuff. You want somewhere comfortable to live, to have nice food, have pleasant surroundings. Fine and dandy. Without other people, there's nothing. And I never could quite figure out how we could get to a place like that where we could really appreciate it. But it's self-evident I think that's the key.
Well, I mean, it could well be part of it, Greg. I've got to say, the spirit in which we've done this book, Simpol Solution, is to try to, not to be puritanical, and try not to be hedonistic, and try not to be overly optimistic or over hopeful, and not to be blaming. That's the spirit we've tried to do this book. And I think one of the things that we could talk about, how we are distracted by all these material pursuits, is not so much in a spiritual or existential context, but we are distracted by it politically. And one of the things I notice is how apathetic lots of young people are about the political process. And I know that's because they don't see choice, really. They don't see choice representing the kind of thing that they want for their world. And one of the things I'm saying is that actually people, we're saying in the book, you've got this vote, and people died for this vote. And it's incredibly powerful when you do wield it, and it can make changes. And there are ways that you can use your vote just out, the same vote just outside the normal channels, which is what Simpol does. And that actually, when you start to participate, and when you stop distracting yourself, I've got to say, when I see people, I travel on planes a lot, I'm afraid, terrible carbon footprint, and I see people distracting themselves just playing computer games when there is so much information around, so much fantastic literature, and so much opportunity to pursue your creative and political projects if you want to. I think our level of distracting ourselves is really a problem, and that plays into the hands of those in the corporate world who want us to be kind of dumb sheep, and live off sugary drinks or whatever it is. And that we don't have to do. And I think we can get involved in politics, and there's tons of stuff going on at a local level. And it may be that in the future that the local level and the global level start to speak to each other a bit more, and that we can discover we're not as impotent as we think, because at the moment everyone thinks they're impotent, and we don't think it's true. And I also suspect that amongst people that I've been meeting since we've been putting this project out, that there are quite a lot of people waiting in the wings with lots of very good ideas ready to be implemented, from basic income to whatever, who are maybe waiting for the moment when the zeitgeist is right, just like in the end of the 70s, the neoliberals were waiting and then got in the act very fast, for the time when actually we are ready to stop being apathetic about our future and leaving it to others or blaming others. And so I look forward to that. And in the meantime, yes, we can pursue lifestyles which are not overtly or over-attached to consumerism, and use less, as it were. But I don't think that is the way out. I think the way out is for us to assert our identity as citizens, as political people, as people with a say in our country. And the older I get, and I've got grandchildren now, the more important that is to me.
Your idea there, part of what you just said, reminds us about a lot of what we've got, even if a lot of people don't like it, is because people who have put it before us, who are handing it to us, are actually responding to what they perceive as a demand. It can become a bit circular after a while, can't it?
Well, it is. You see, that is the point. We're all in the same game together. we're all in the same game. I mean, I spent lots of time in my life waiting, thinking, when are people going to stop buying the Sun? And so that it doesn't have that influence on us anymore. Stuff like that. So it is a joint game. It's a joint game. It's producer and consumer, and we can get out of the stalemate, I think, by taking note of what the world needs and putting pressure on our elected representatives, such as they are, and not giving up, it's not like actually when you have an election and then there's 4 or 5 years of these people in power, then politics is over again. It's not like because Theresa May says now we have an election, now we suddenly got politics again. We also know, one of the things we should have seen is that voting does bring about changes. It can work, and it is very, very difficult to predict in these days. So that should be an incentive to people to feel their power. Now, I suggest that actually that they sort of allow themselves to go a little bit beyond their cherished identities as this nation or this protesting group or this maligned group or whatever, and just think about the problems we have in the world, and imagine what is it going to need to cooperate and to deal with this. And it doesn't need, as you were saying earlier, great whole new institutions of more faceless bureaucrats. It needs us all to get involved, and it needs it's like 10% of people in the world to start thinking generally world-centric, and the change will happen.
A lot of the thinking, as you say at the minute, is, and I've alluded to this several times, is very defensive. It's very much about keeping out the other and, stopping these trends, that we can somehow wind things back, and that if we can deprive others of something, then we can have that. It's sort of with the elite, in corporations, business and banking and everything else, you can see this sort of slightly ivory tower mentality, or perhaps we should more put it like survival at the cost of someone else. We'll pull up the ladder. There's, limited resources to go round, so we'll get our bit.
Yeah.
We'll make it through this. We've got to deprive other people of something for us to survive. But it's a zero-sum game at the end of the day, however long it takes and at whatever stage. And these things are not all going to converge at the same time. But some of these crises we're looking at, they're going to come to a head, to a point where we can't sort of make do and mend anymore, and we certainly can't have the status quo, and we are unable to go back to a previous way of doing things. We see this. I talked with John about, the popular dystopian science fiction, and the usual arc of all that is that you have converging crises, you have a breakdown, and out the other side you have the re-emergence of cooperation and building, as people begin to revert to their basic true nature, which is kind of like, well, we help each other because that's best for everyone. And you can see that actually in the actual history of human societies. We have this converging crises, breakdown, the re-emergence of cooperation. So one way or another, name your crisis, we will have to face it, and we have to address it. It's just a question of how well prepared we are for that, what sort of level of fallout we're prepared to accept, etc., etc. So there's no getting away from this.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's very interesting. In evolutionary biology, there's been a lot of studies done which shows that, talking about the cooperative or the altruistic spirit, does it exist? And if so, is it inbuilt, and how does it work best? And there's a consensus that's been come to at the moment, is that competition works best within groups. That means if you have a group of people competing to be the best guitar player, for example, that's a really good way of promoting excellence. But if, on the other hand, that actually between groups, if you have between groups that cooperation and altruism is the most effective way of getting the best out of a gathering of groups. So, if you have a bunch of good guitar players, and if they're not waiting for the other, you're giving them time to come in for their solo, they're all soloing at the same time, it's going to be total cacophony. If they're all competing, in music, it doesn't work. Competition doesn't work in music. Music only works by everybody cooperating. And it doesn't mean to say everyone's the same. It doesn't mean to say that you have to be as good as the lead player in your band to play with them. So the cooperative spirit is actually, it's not simply a product of altruism. It is a product of, it's about effectiveness. And the Simpol Solution is not saying we've got to be more altruistic and caring about each other, and it's not saying we've got to be more sort of make do with less and be more puritanistic about things, but it is saying is that there are things that we have to deal with which we cannot do without cooperation. We cannot actually get working if we are still having the identity that everybody is trying to do better than me, and I better lower my rates before all the business moves elsewhere. It is saying that actually this is a solution that we will have to come to in the end, as you're saying, in one of those sort of dystopian functions, because in the scenarios, because in the end people have to cooperate, because otherwise you perish. So what we are saying is let's envisage that process now. Let's see that that's where we are, and let's see how rapidly we can work together through the most minimalistic exterior forms by actually expanding our identities and knowing that we actually have to do it before the shit hits the fan. Because I have to tell you, in the early phases of everything falling apart, what it means is that the one with the biggest club wins. The bullies win in the short term, at least, in that sort of thing, and it's very unpleasant. And that's not the world I want for my grandchildren.
No, and as you say, the alternative to making it through this in some shape or form is annihilation. I mean, if we let's just be extreme about it. That remains a possibility. And I'm not talking about the sun going supernova. There's no Earth anymore, but we have it within our capacity at the minute to make life on this Earth untenable for humans.
Yes, we do.
If we choose to go down that route. So it's really a question of the opportunity that exists within this challenge. And we have done this before. We may come to an end on this planet, our species, at some point, but we have overcome challenges before, and we have come out the other end, and in many ways ended up being better off, however you define that. And maybe it's a case of 2 steps forward, 1 step back.
Yeah, that's right. I think we're definitely where we are at the moment is we're on this 1 step back just before the 2 step forward, but has to be taken. Now, the interesting thing, the French have a phrase called reculer pour mieux sauter, which means that on 1 step back, you're gathering up energy like a spring ready for the next piece. So hopefully, the next, when we're ready to make it, we can make this change quickly.
Just in closing, Nick, what reaction have you personally had to talking with people about any of these concepts, since the book has been published in particular? Now, I talked with John about, reviews coming in and reactions from various quarters, but just give us, your personal experience. Have you had any light bulb moments with people? Have you been experiencing some of the well-worn resistance that I discussed earlier?
Well, it's very interesting that we've had just prior to putting out the book, we had lots and lots of endorsements from all kinds of academics who really backed it. And I was quite I was quite shocked how supportive so many people were, because academics are not great at backing other people's work usually. So that was really, really surprising. And we've had some people on Amazon readers giving us glowing reviews, how it's changed them totally, their ideas about politics. But it's been a bit of a slog trying to get into the mainstream, because it's so kind of not mainstream, this issue. And we haven't had, the reviews we've wanted to in the mainstream yet, he said. And we've had one thorough trashing in a sort of a traditional left-wing magazine called Tribune, where they completely derided us for our optimism, and you see, that's understandable, because the old left really needs to have some bad guys to be there to be blamed for everything. And actually, that's the main thing we're saying in this book. Look, there's no bad guys. We're all in this. We're all in this. There's people who are profiting more, and there's people who are losing more. And of course, there are some unscrupulous people, but it's not going to help us anymore blaming anybody. We keep blaming, and the problems don't get solved.
Okay, Nick. Well, we could talk about this at no end, and I will just say in the book that you and John have written, The Simpol Solution is the main title. There's a lot of very interesting material about psychology and how that's the key to helping us move ahead with all of this. Just in closing, is there anything that you'd like to share relating to this, or perhaps your own work? Listeners can find all of our previous interviews linked on this page, but just if there's anything you'd like to say in closing, please do so.
Well, if there's people are interested in how to look at the world through a psycho-historical lens, because it's not a very well-known word, and it's not then if they go to my website, Wounded Leaders, there's a page about psychohistory. Otherwise, John's website, Simpol.org, will tell you all about the political initiative and the book.
Splendid. Well, Nick, thank you so much for joining us once again.
Been my pleasure. It is my pleasure, Greg. Absolutely marvellous to have been invited. Thank you.